In 2012, when the Syrian Civil War had just erupted, fighters of the Free Syrian Army stumbled across a desert cache holding 5,000 rifles still glistening with storage grease. They were sure they'd just hit the jackpot, a stash of captured AKs, and handed them out buzzing with excitement. But they were wrong. Those rifles were Sturmgewehr 44s, STG-44's weapons once carried by German soldiers and regarded as the grandfather of the modern assault rifle. By 1944, as the STG-44 was about to make its appearance, Germany was no longer the relentless attacker of the early war years, but a country desperately trying to cling to every mile of ground on the map. World War II was grinding toward its end, fronts were collapsing one by one, and in Berlin, people began nursing the fantasy that a single miracle weapon might somehow reverse everything. But behind the slogans and propaganda, there was a brutally practical question. What kind of weapon did the infantrymen actually need in this new kind of war? For decades, the long rifle had been the symbol of the soldier, long-range, powerful cartridge, serious punch. But in the close, chaotic fighting of towns, villages, and trench networks on the Eastern Front, that advantage turned into a burden. Long rifles were heavy-fired. One shot at a time had a low practical rate of fire, and were awkward to handle in alleys, corners, and muddy trenches. At the other extreme, you had submachine guns, compact, very high rate of fire, but short-ranged with weaker pistol rounds that lost effectiveness as the distance opened up. The battlefield had changed. The infantry's weapons had not caught up. Soldiers needed firepower that was truly effective at the ranges they actually fought at. A few hundred meters, not just on paper. They needed a weapon that could fire quickly like a submachine gun, but with more punch and better accuracy. In other words, there was a deadly gap between rifles and submachine guns. And the need to fill that gap opened the door for a new kind of in-between weapon, the foundation of the entire assault rifle concept that came after. When we talk about the MKB-42 and the 7.92-33 medium Kurz cartridge, we're talking about a mental reset in how people thought about infantry weapons, not just chopping down the length of a rifle case. For decades, European armies had clung to two poles, either full-size rifles firing long, powerful cartridges with heavy recoil and a slow rate of fire, or submachine guns firing short pistol rounds very fast, but only really effective up close. The Kurz round sat squarely between those two worlds, larger than pistol ammo, but shorter than standard rifle cartridges. The idea was simple but bold. Create a cartridge with enough punch at the real fighting ranges of 200-300 meters, but mild enough to let a soldier fire rapidly and still keep his sights on target. Hugo Schmeisser, a name very familiar to anyone who loves weapons history, was the man who turned that idea into reality with the MKB-42. He wasn't dreaming of a rifle that looked good on the parade ground. He wanted a carbine that could be built quickly and cheaply using stamped steel instead of intricate machining. The MKB-42 fired the Kurz round and offered both semi-automatic and full-auto fire. In other words, the soldier now held in his hands both a rifle and a submachine gun rolled into one weapon. And as always, the final exam wasn't on the drawing board. It was on the battlefield. German troops at the front quickly took to the MKB-42. In full auto, the gun stayed controllable. It didn't kick its muzzle up into the sky like a full-power rifle, and it didn't run out of steam like pistol ammunition. A single soldier with an MKB-42 could put out the kind of firepower that used to require a whole team backing him up. In other words, the MKB-42 wasn't just the predecessor of the STG-44. It was the quiet turning point that changed the role of each individual soldier on the firing line forever. In the story of the STG-44, the most dramatic twist comes from the very top of Germany's leadership. Many historians believe Hitler disliked the MKB-42 because he was still haunted by his World War I experience. In his mind, a proper soldier carried a long-range rifle, firing carefully aimed single shots at several hundred meters. A fast-firing weapon using a medium cartridge geared towards suppressive fire, like the MKB-42, clashed completely with that image. On top of that was the ego of a man who saw himself as a military genius. Any new weapon had to be something he personally ordered, not something that emerged from a designer's drawing board on its own. The result was a cold decision halt production of a weapon frontline troops were praising enthusiastically. But the battlefield doesn't obey orders written on paper. German generals who could read the frontline reports perfectly well chose to bend the rules. They continued developing the MKB-42 behind Hitler's back, renaming it the MP-43 and submitting it as an improved submachine gun. On paper, it was a submachine gun. In reality, it was an entirely new class of weapon. Eventually, Hitler caught on to this little naming game. But by then, reports from the Eastern Front were talking about the MP-43 in a very different tone. Small units armed with it could lay down enough firepower to overpower larger enemy formations. Hitler was furious, but he couldn't ignore the reality any longer. He demanded that an MP-43 be brought for him to test personally. And that moment when he pulled the trigger changed the story. He was impressed enough to give it a new name himself. Sturmgewehr German. For assault, assaulting rifle Sturm, meaning assault, Gewehr, meaning rifle. From that moment on, not only did a new name exist, the very concept of the assault rifle stepped formally into military history. Technically, the STG-44 was a clear break from the infantry weapons of its time. The rifle was about 94 cm long and weighed around 5.2 kg, loaded with 30 rounds. Not exactly light, but acceptable for a World War II infantryman, especially considering the flexibility it offered. Its theoretical rate of fire was about 550–600 rounds per minute, with a muzzle velocity of nearly 685 km/s, giving it an effective range of about 600 meters in semi-auto and around 300 meters in sustained automatic fire. In essence, the STG-44 could serve as a reasonably accurate rifle in semi-automatic mode, or become a flood of fire at short to medium range when switched to full auto, making it the backbone of squad-level firepower. Experiments with the Vampire infrared sight and the curved Krumlauf barrel attachment showed Germany's attempts to adapt to night fighting and urban combat, even if many of these applications remained experimental rather than truly widespread solutions. For American soldiers, the STG-44 didn't appear first in propaganda or manuals. It appeared through their sights. In the winter of 1944-1945 in the Ardennes, American troops really met the STG-44 for the first time. They went into the woods armed with the M1 Garand, a powerful semi-automatic rifle but limited to 8-round clips, and they were used to having the edge in fast, accurate mid-range fire. Facing German squads armed with STG-44s, that advantage slipped away fast. One side had to pause constantly to reload. The other kept up the tempo with 30-round magazines switching from semi-automatic to full auto with a flick of a selector. Christer Bergstrom notes that in many engagements, units equipped with the Sturmgewehr allowed smaller German forces to exert superior firepower and pressure on American formations. In other words, the STG-44 wasn't just firing bullets, it was firing straight into the enemy's tempo of combat. Even though it was mass-produced from 1944 onward, with a little over 400,000 rifles built, the STG-44 only had time to appear in the final collapsing months of Nazi Germany. After the war, General Staff had to face an uncomfortable truth. Most infantry engagements did not take place at 801 Salauren meters, like in the training manuals, but at medium ranges, where rate of fire and weapon control mattered more than the sheer power of a single round. From that realization, a new formula took shape: intermediate cartridges. Plus, selective fire became the gold standard for modern infantry combat. In that wave of change, the STG-44 was not a blueprint to be copied bolt for bolt, but the original idea that many nations drew from to develop rifles capable of semi-automatic and full auto fire with intermediate cartridges, more compact yet still sufficiently lethal. And what about the claim that the AK-47 copied the STG-44? Yes. The two rifles look quite similar on the outside, which led many Western sources to say Kalashnikov copied the design. But the AK concept was being sketched out as early as 1942, when the STG-44 was still a secret. And inside, the two weapons are built around completely different mechanisms and design philosophies. To say the STG-44 had no influence at all would be wrong. But to dismiss the AK-47 as nothing more than a clone is to oversimplify a very complex historical story. After 1945, the journey of the STG-44 did not end with the collapse of Germany. The Red Army captured large numbers as war trophies, and unlike many Western militaries obsessed with famous handguns, the Soviets paid close attention to this strange new kind of firepower. From there, the STG-44 began a tour around the world. It appeared here and there during the First Indochina War, then sporadically in Vietnam and Algeria, and later in various conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Ogaden, Lebanon. Not in large numbers, but enough for the sharp-eyed to spot instantly. It was no longer a young weapon, but it had never really retired. From European battlefields in 1944 to a sandy depot in the Syrian desert in 2012, the metal has aged and the paint has faded, but the idea behind the STG-44 remains strikingly modern. A weapon of the last century, and a clear imprint on the map of wars in this one. Looking back at the STG-44's journey, we see a classic paradox of military history. It was born as a miracle weapon in the death throes of the German regime, yet ended up marking the beginning of an entirely new era for modern infantry. A single rifle cannot change the outcome of a war, but it can change how wars are fought. The mindset of intermediate cartridge, semi-auto, and full auto fire, one man carrying the firepower of an entire team that began with the STG-44, flowed straight into the blueprints of countless later designs. Whether it's the M16, the AK-47, or today's assault rifles, each went its own way, but all share the same answer that the STG-44 first posed: what kind of firepower does the soldier on the battlefield really need? War has receded into the past, but behind those familiar names stands the quiet silhouette of an old grandfather called the STG-44. So in your view, among the three names that truly shaped modern infantry, the STG-44, the AK-47, and the M16, which one deserves most to be called the weapon that changed war?